Hello, It Depends listeners. During July and August, I am taking a break after 18 months of a new episode every other week. I'm taking the summer off. But during this time, I'm bringing you earlier episodes that you might have missed, especially if you've joined the podcast later on. Things that hopefully will get you to go back and look back through some of the archives, because there's some pretty good stuff there, if I say so myself. So anything you hear from the beginning of the theme music in just a few seconds, just be aware that's an older episode. So if I'm talking about giving a talk or some event coming up, that has already happened. However, here in 2025, in October, I'll be speaking in New York. I'll be speaking once again at the Lead Dev Conference. So if you're coming to New York for Lead Dev, I'll see you there. I'll also be at Leading Eng and happy to meet up with folks there as well. So please enjoy this previous episode of the It Depends Lessons in Technology Leadership podcast. See you with new episodes in September. Welcome to the It Depends Lessons in Technology Leadership podcast. I, as always, am your host, Kevin Goldsmith. In this first season of the podcast, we have been serializing the audiobook of my book, It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 22, which was published last year by Unit Circle Press. And we're almost at the end. We're on chapter 35 of 36 this week. And to celebrate reaching the end of the book, this is a very special episode, because on this episode, for the first time on the podcast, I am not alone. I am joined by Kevin Stewart, who has been a friend and a peer and someone who we used to sit in each other's offices and share what was going on for many years while we were both at Adobe. Still keep in touch with him, still value his insights. And I always like, and you'll hear it on this podcast, he'll call me on my stuff. He'll point out where he disagrees. And that's an incredibly valuable thing for you as you go through your career journey, to have somebody that can call you out when they disagree, that can challenge you. Kevin has absolutely been that for me. So it was delightful to have him be the first guest. Kevin today is an SVP of Engineering at Splice, and he'll talk about that. You'll hear more about that in a minute. But he is also an engineering executive focused on building teams to build products. He has helped shape the engineering culture at a number of startups, digital agencies, and cloud companies. Kevin is particularly experienced in leading remote and distributed teams to consistently deliver quality products. Although he currently resides in Seattle, Kevin is a lifelong New Yorker with dreams of relocating to a sunny island in the Caribbean. I, as a native Chicagoan, and Kevin is a native New Yorker. You can find some of our amazing pizza battles on Twitter back in the days. I'm not going to do a big deep dive into this chapter, because already this is going to be one of the longest, if not the longest episode of the podcast, because Kevin and I had a pretty long and fairly wide-ranging conversation, and I'm really excited to share that with you. So I'm going to do that now. So first, we're going to hear my conversation with Kevin Stewart, talking about the myth of the startup in the large company, which is the chapter that we're covering this week. And then we'll hear the chapter. So here's my conversation with Kevin Stewart. Hey, Kevin. Well, welcome. So happy to have you join me. It's so great to talk to you.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
I thought about calling this one like Kevin Squared. That's what when we get together, that's what I always call those meetings, double Kevin. So you and I have shared history. You heard a little bit about it in the intro, but we were together at Adobe for like 9 years. As I talked about in your background, so you come before Adobe, you spent a lot of time at startups. And then after Adobe, you went into startups. One of them got acquired by a big company, but then you're back at startups again. Honestly, you've got a lot more time in startups than I did. I spent more time early years, kind of big companies. Then I ran to a startup and then did another startup. And then the whole industry imploded and I ran back to big companies and then was there for another like 10 years before I have been now back at startup. So we have kind of similar experience in the middle and then very different experience kind of beforehand and similar experience after. This chapter is a lot about innovation and why big companies struggle to innovate like startups. I was curious, you and I have this same shared experience at Adobe, and I will say, I've never said this before, but this chapter is about Adobe. Like, I wrote this. Yeah, really. I wrote this in 2014. It was a year after I left Adobe, and I was now at Spotify at a big startup, but a startup that worked like a startup. After having been really banging my head against the wall at Adobe for several years, Adobe trying to innovate and just really struggled to innovate in-house on new products. Obviously, the existing products continued to innovate, but new products was just really hard. And I built a new product at Adobe and just hit a lot of the walls I write about in the chapter. You also were working on new technologies and you worked with a lot of products. I'm writing about stuff from my perspective, but you have a different background. How much did that jibe with you? Do you agree or do you think, yeah, well, it's not quite the way I saw it?
Well, I think there's a reason why I left Adobe and went right back to startups. It completely jives. I loved my Adobe experience. I, in fact, went to Adobe thinking, hey, I'm going to learn how big, successful software companies work. And I did. And that's kind of why I went back to startups. We both had the experience of trying to innovate and have some of that startup DNA on the teams that we led at Adobe. And, I'd say there were varying measures of success for each of us. But at the end of the day, Adobe was a large company and it had large company mechanics to it. And that just got in the way of trying to really function as agilely and as innovative as a startup might. And sometimes you just have to stop going against the grain and, figure out, do you really want to work at a startup, or do you want to work in a large company? Because they are very different.
Yeah, I think that's a really apt way of looking at it and also a very accurate depiction of the company a bit. I think one of the things that I remember you were really good at, you always would find these little pockets of the folks that came in from startups and would befriend them and in some ways try and help them, but also kind of be a guide for them or maybe, just find people that were kind of similar thinking to you. What was your experience with those startups that joined the company through acquisition and then tried to find their feet?
It was definitely a challenge for all of them, whether it was the folks from Typekit or PhoneGap, Behance. I think I found them mostly because you sort of seek out your kindred spirits. So as we worked with some of these teams, you just end up talking with folks and realizing, oh, you have a lot in common. And, they would then confide like, yeah, this whole big company thing's like my first experience. I don't know how it's going to work or if things are going to change a lot. So just by building relationships and talking to folks, you learn what their concerns are. And then you realize, yep, went through all of this like several years ago. Let me tell you how I got through it. And that's sort of how I built bonds with a lot of folks over the years. And all of it was sort of driven by this sort of, hey, I'm coming in, from the smaller company into this big, large ecosystem, and I have no idea how to navigate it. And having someone who's been through it, definitely something that they appreciated. And to this day, I have plenty of friends from that time period who just were glad that I was there to give them some guidance. May not have been perfect guidance at the time, but it was definitely something they could relate to.
You give the guidance you can give, I guess. And as long as you're well-intentioned, even if you're wrong, it's coming from the right place. I thought it was interesting. After Adobe, you went to NodeSource and then you went to Heptio. And Heptio got acquired, I think, after you left, or I'm trying to remember history.
Yeah, it was a little after I left. It was in the works around the time I was still there. And then like several months afterwards that it got acquired by VMware.
The leadership had come out of big companies and was probably very comfortable, or maybe comfortable moving back in, but you'd hired most, if not all, the engineers at Heptio when you were VP there. And so I'm assuming, because it happened not long after you left, you kept in touch with it. Most of the people you hired were coming out of either open source or small companies. VMware is a very big, old school kind of company. Heptio was a very fast moving startup. Did you see them get challenged in how they had to adjust to the speed of working at that bigger company?
Oh, absolutely. I'd say the majority of them were having mini freakouts on a weekly basis. I was having lots of coffee meetings with folks there afterwards, sort of like talk them off the ledge and explain to them like, well, what did you think was going to happen? I'm like, we were literally doing an enterprise open source business. We were going to probably get an exit going to another enterprise company. And there was, a lot of very young and idealistic folks there that I had hired who felt that, oh, well, even though we're going to VMware, we're going to keep the Heptio vibe. And like, oh, my sweet summer child, that's not how that was. Let me explain to you how it really works. You'll be shoved under some middle manager somewhere and you'll have like 20 other things you need to integrate with. And it won't even closely resemble what you were used to in our wonderful little startup fantasy land. It's going to look like an enterprise operation and you're going to have to adapt. And a few people did. A lot of people didn't and bounced right after that and went back to startup land. But for the folks that I was still counseling, that were staying there to, fully vest, it was a big culture shock to them. They just couldn't comprehend how a company like VMware worked compared to what they were experienced to at Heptio.
That point exactly comes back to the crux of what I was trying to talk about. Talking this idea of Heptio kind of going into VMware and everybody thinking, well, we're going to keep this kind of fast-paced, innovative culture. And it's like, oh no, you're going to be doing all this other work that big companies have to do that is now part of your job, but is not part of your job at this smaller company. That's the crux. I talk about it in the chapter about this idea of resource contention, because I think that was one of the things that really struck me building a brand new product at Adobe and getting some level of success with it, and doing that by like fending everyone off and saying, just leave us alone, we're building this thing, kind of skunkworks style. Yep. And then all of a sudden, like the entire weight of the organization basically collapsed on us. We reach a level of success building a product. No success, you just get killed, right? And everybody gets put on new jobs or laid off or whatever.
Right.
Which we're talking about in the chapter. Really amazingly successul product. You're now redefining the company in the context of this product, and you can tell everyone to go pound sand because you're the most important thing in the company. We were in that middle stage of, hey, we're doing really well. Everything's going in up and to the right, but we're not so big that we get to tell other people what to do. And eventually, like IT and other products started saying, you have to integrate with us or you have to do things in the correct way. And it just killed all momentum. We built this like momentum machine. It just killed all this momentum.
Yeah.
And a year later, trying to figure out what it was that like is about big companies that really slows this innovation thing down. And for me, it was that idea of resource contention of you're making money, but you're not making enough money to justify massive amounts of further investment. And you're competing with these other products that are making like 100 times what you're making. So it's hard to argue that you should get stuff because it's a zero-sum game, in corporate budget.
Yeah.
How accurate do you think that is from your view inside a bigger company like Fastly or Adobe versus like that small company?
Resource contention is definitely a factor, but it shows up differently. definitely at Adobe, I ran into the resource contention problem from like day one. The first Creative Cloud meeting I was in, which was like end of 2010, we were like in this big conference room in San Jose, and they were just trying to talk about the project, and everything else was resourced except my stuff. And my manager was there, and they were like, oh, so-and-so, where's your team? And he pointed at me and said, that's my team right there. And I had acquired a separate team that was working on the traditional creative suite and a service for that. And I think the idea was to try and find some way to leverage them to do the work for Creative Cloud. But I also had to recruit other engineers. And one of the first roadblocks I faced was I was trying to bring over an engineer from my previous team, and they weren't really doing anything. They were working on some BS project. But that manager, who used to be my manager, fought tooth and nail to keep this person from moving over to work on what was essentially going to be the most important project in the company. And there was no rationale behind it. I had my manager meet with that manager and say, look, these are the priorities of the company. Here's, what the impact is going to be. And this went on for like a month and a half before they finally transferred the engineer over, simply because headcount is such a coin of the realm in large companies. So nobody wants to give it up, even if it's for the good of the business. They don't care. It's like, hold on to your people. It's less that problem at startups. It's more that you just don't have people and you don't have money to hire them at the point. So I've worked in mostly early stage startups. So depending on what your seed funding was or whether you're Series A, Series B, dictated how many engineers you could hire. And along with that came sort of what's the risk profile, because hiring at NodeSource was completely different than hiring at Heptio. At NodeSource, it was like, yes, Node.js was a big thing at that point, but most of the founders were personalities in the Node.js ecosystem, but they hadn't had business impact. Whereas at Heptio, you had 2 of the 3 co-creators of Kubernetes as the founders of the company. That attracted engineers. Like, I couldn't turn away at that point. So it really depends on what are the dynamics of the startup, what's the motivation, whether or not you get the resources you need. Whereas in a big company, it's, can you get enough budget to hire the people you need? Or do you have to try and convince engineers from other teams to join that effort? And if you do, you're most likely going to run into their management basically trying to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, that problem, that headcount problem is so pervasive in big companies. I definitely saw that. I saw that at Microsoft. I saw that at IBM. I saw that at Adobe. And it is a weird thing, because you're right. The stuff you were working on was so much more important than whatever that developer was spending their time on. But that manager was probably bonused and evaluated based on their impact, and one fewer developer means they don't have as much impact. It's that kind of perverse incentive problem and that bigger companies kind of are riddled with. And by the way, when I joined Adobe, one of the things I really liked after having come from Microsoft, which is 10 times worse, like 10, 100 million times worse than Adobe ever was. Like, one of the first things that happened at Adobe was I was working on this project for Creative Suite, and my team was a brand new team, and we're taking it over from Photoshop Elements, I think. And so we were taking over their code because they was turning this thing that was part of Elements and turning it into a thing for the Creative Suite. And the manager, Julie, said, hey, do you want to take this engineer? Because he really knows this stuff and it'll be way easier to adopt it. And the idea that somebody would just give us an engineer,
that's unheard of.
It was after coming from Microsoft, where what would have probably happened would have been the manager would have told us, I'm going to kill your project. I'm going to get you all fired. I'm going to have I'm going to have the principal call your kids out from school to tell them daddy's been fired, kind of mentality. It was like blew my mind. Oh my God, it's so much nicer here. After 9 years of the company, I went, well, it's nicer.
All relative, man. All relative. And this was pre-Satya Microsoft for listeners. It was a different world back then.
Yeah. And so having gone from there to Spotify, where it was just free flowing, oh, you need help with what that team's working on is clearly more important than what we're working on. So that's all good. And not only within like a tribe, but even from tribe to tribe, it was just a different culture and a different way of thinking about it. And it's so, I still talk about it all the time because it completely rewired my thinking. But the thing I wanted to ask you was, now we're both exec team and have been for a while. At some level during my time at Adobe, drove me to say, you know what, I really want to be in that exec level, was the realization of, wow, we do a bunch of stupid stuff. I really would like to be in a position where I could stop us doing stupid stuff like protecting your teams, all these perverse incentives built into the organization. Did you have a similar experience or similar kind of thought?
I did for a little bit, and then I learned that that was wrong. The hard way, of course. Sure. I mean, I got so frustrated with some of these seemingly inane just roadblocks I was running into. I'm like, all right, if I get a seat at the table, I'm going to change a bunch of things.
Yeah.
And the reality is, and I think we kind of danced around it, but let's say it explicitly, the culture of the company has a huge impact on what you're actually able to do. And companies like Adobe that came up in the same time frame as Microsoft has a lot of stuff built into its DNA that is really hard to dislodge. It's just baked in. And that's why this whole idea of like having a team that runs like a startup within this larger company is a myth. It's because you're going to run into the headwinds of that DNA sooner rather than later. And it's always going to just be an uphill battle to explain why this new way of doing things or this new technology is the thing that you should be pursuing, because people are so set in their ways and like, this is the way we've always done it. Perfect example. No one's going to question you using GitHub to store your code and collaborate with other developers. Like, that's pretty much standard fare. When we were at Adobe, that wasn't what we used. In fact, around that time that we were both working on our relative projects, that we were running into that impedance mismatch of like, hey, we want to bring developers from the inside in, or we want to work in this more modern way. And we were fighting the system internally to use GitHub. Even like we finally got them to use GitHub Enterprise because they wanted it controlled, they wanted it hosted internally. But even that took like almost a year of effort just to get them to accept GitHub as a way of doing software development. Open source was another big thing that was took a while for it to become the norm and to become accepted, because it just wasn't what they were used to. That wasn't how they built the company. So anytime you try to bring this foreign object into the system, it would get rejected, or at least would definitely be meeting some antibodies that were fighting it all the time. And constantly doing that when you could look outside your window across the street and there's a startup that's doing all the things you want to do, but you can't do it, gets to you after a while. And I thought, especially in the Creative Club, like, all right, I'm going to be able to force some change around here now that I'm like flying to San Francisco every other week and I'm sitting at the leadership table with all the other leaders. No. It sounds good, but that was not reality. I just realized that there was still a layer above me that was going to have the final say on a lot of different things. And that definitely contributed to me eventually deciding to leave Adobe and say, look, I'm only going to have this level of influence and impact at a smaller company where I'm one of many. And, at that stage of my career, that's what I needed. And that's why I left.
Yeah, you reminded me of the whole GitHub thing, because, this is a perfect example of why bigger companies struggle. We adopted GitHub on Revel.
Mm-hmm.
And AWS. AWS was another one that we adopted. And nobody at the company was doing it at that time. Maybe your team was. I don't remember.
Yeah, we were.
And I had to fight tooth and nail, meeting after meeting with IT and corporate security and all this stuff to be allowed to use these technologies, which were not the standard ones. We did so much work. I wasted so much time to make this happen for my team because it was the appropriate tools for us to use. It wasn't just because we wanted to do it. It was because this was the correct tool for us to use to build in the way we needed to build. But in order to do that, it took, I don't know, literally probably months of my time. And like Dan, who worked for me, hit tons of his time spent sitting down with the IT team, explaining to them this stuff over and over and over again. And that is one of the reasons why, yeah, you're right. There's this kind of status quo. This is how we do it here.
Mm-hmm. I'll do you one better.
Yeah.
At the time you were dealing with that, the team that I had taken over was basically told that they had to build on acrobat.com as their platform for their services. And for you go way back in the history books, acrobat.com at that time was built on like Windows servers and was a huge model implementation. And when I first took over the team and I was helping them, evolve their service and write some new features, I think this was for Creative Suite 5.5 at the time. And it was the complete opposite way that anyone would build a service today. We had this whole team that was across the country in Boston that had no transparency into how their system, there's no observability. They wouldn't help us when we were like having outages at the time. It was like we would all be in this conference room trying to be on the phone with them to debug whatever was going wrong. And they literally would like give us no information. They're like, we're looking into it. And it was hours of silence interspersed with some minuscule update. Meanwhile, our service is down and we have no control over anything. And there was this expectation because acrobat.com was an official platform that we would be building Creative Cloud on this official platform. At which point I said, hell no. So I did the skunkworks thing. Said, yeah, we're going to do AWS, but we'll play along and basically say, well, we'll use acrobat.com as sort of like an API platform. We'll call their APIs, but from AWS, which was my small way of saying, yeah, as soon as I get away from acrobat.com, we'll just be on AWS. We'll have our own APIs, which was exactly how that turned out. Except there was yet another internal platform at the time called the shared cloud, which was somehow then mandated that we must use. And I spent, of the 10 months from start to launching Creative Cloud at Max in 2011, probably 6 of those months basically working around and duplicating the functionality of the shared cloud just so we could have like control over our own destiny until I eventually ran into that wall of, well, yeah, I'm not going to get enough headcount to actually like run all these services on my own Windows servers in AWS when the shared cloud exists. So I'm going to have to capitulate. And it broke my heart because there were so many things that were just wrong about that solution. But yeah, you either have to go completely skunkworks and do all these things behind the scenes, or you have to negotiate with a bunch of people internally who don't even understand the things you're trying to do or why it's a better way. But if you're going to make headway, you're going to have those negotiations. And luckily, you and I had a mutual on the Photoshop team that helped specifically with the GitHub situation to basically broker those changes for you. I think finally in the end, when we got from GitHub Enterprise to using GitHub.com, I was actually in a meeting about Creative Cloud with Shantanu, and someone brought up this whole GitHub controversy, and he just looked at us like we were crazy. He was like, we're going to let this get in the way of us actually changing the culture of this company and the business model. So just freaking use GitHub. Then it was no longer an issue once Shantanu said that, but boy, it took a lot of effort to get there.
That last point is, I think, really important. Shantanu didn't care. Why would he? There's a problem to be solved and he wants it solved. And he doesn't care about the details. He cares about the business challenge. And maybe the next level down from Shantanu, probably got that as well. And then there was, another level. I don't remember, maybe 2 levels. And then you and me. And somewhere in there, like there's a whole mess of other priorities and conflicts and fiefdoms.
Yep.
And is it that because our organizations are flatter today. And so it is a lot easier for you or me to drill the core all the way to the bottom and see kind of what's going on and say, like, stop that nonsense. But is that just an inherent problem in larger organizations? Like the levels of leadership, that kind of stuff just naturally happens. We talked about like VMware, Adobe, Microsoft. These are all 80s era companies. Do you think more recent but large companies, Facebook or Amazon or one of those companies, do you think they have that problem the same way that the 80s era companies do?
They do, because they imported a lot of talent from those 80s companies. Like Google hired a bunch of Microsoft folks, Amazon did. Then the Microsoft folks that infected Google spread out to other companies like Facebook. So they inherited a lot of the behaviors from those companies, because for the longest time, that was the way to do software development. So people thought that, oh, well, if I hire these senior leaders from these big companies, we too will get the magic rub and we'll be as successful as them. And the pathology just goes all the way down from there.
I think that's a really great point. Yeah, that was the question. We're talking about the myth of the startup and the large company. And really what we're talking about is, can you really innovate in the way a startup innovates in a bigger company? What's interesting is you're right. Amazon hired a bunch of Microsoft people. Google hired a bunch of Microsoft people. I'm sure a lot of VMware people at Google too. These folks trained in the old way ended up in some of these next generation companies. And now companies, as they grow, are hiring people from Google, and they're hiring people from Facebook, and they're hiring people from these other companies or Meta or whatever. Do you think just that DNA just continues to get persisted in company after company? Nobody's figured out how to do this on a big scale of, let's say, like a 5,000 to 10,000 to 15,000 person company at this point? Like they'll all have this problem?
I think they will. One, there just aren't any good examples of companies of that size avoided the problem. But part of it also comes from where these companies get funded. It's their VCs. I've seen this playbook in startups over and over again. Once you get past Series B and you're starting to get to that next stage of hypergrowth, your investors start running their own playbook. What operators you need at a certain scale in sales and marketing and engineering. So they help perpetuate this model of if you're going to be this size company, these are the types of people you need to help you lead the company into that stage of growth. So it just becomes this vicious circle of a lot of the same behaviors and attitudes and culture that just gets propagated from company to company, because to get to that size company, you're most likely going to be a venture-backed startup. And the people that basically give you the money also give you a lot of quote unquote advice on how to be successful at that stage.
I think that's another great observation. I think that is absolutely true. It also makes me think the rise of PE, as it kind of takes over in some ways, where venture was more driven, but PE, even growth PE, where you're still focused on company growth over, let's say, margins. My own experience working with PE private equity, I should explain, was that it was very much more focused on margin and less focused on growth. But obviously you have a lot of private equity firms now working more in the roles that VCs tended to have, where they're really much more focused on company growth. Mm-hmm. But they still have a little bit more of an eye towards efficiency. So that also kind of coinciding with this post-zero interest rate world, where there isn't unlimited money. You're not seeing the hyperscaling kind of playbook anymore. And the scale-ups, certainly post-COVID, that's really gone away. This new world of, we still want to grow, we're still going to set aggressive growth targets, and we're not going to sweat margins so much, but we're not going to let the company go in the red to do it. I don't know if those playbooks match that kind of Microsoft, Google kind of mindset. Obviously, you work with tighter budgets and less, and ironically, less resources, even at these 10, 15, 20, $100 billion companies. Apple has tiny teams, given what they build. Do you think in this new world we're in, those kind of traditional skill sets, that 80s era mentality, do you think that's still going to get kind of pushed onto startups as kind of end up kind of bleeding them of their innovation?
I think to a certain extent, yes, it will still get pushed just because, again, it's familiar. It's what everybody knows. There will be some pockets of change here and there, but I think the fundamental question of why running a startup inside of the largest company is a myth comes down to the basic dynamics of what a startup is and what a fully established large business is. And it comes down to risk. The reason why startups are able to innovate is because they have more on the line than a large company. When you and I were working at Adobe, if our project didn't succeed, okay, maybe our team gets dissolved and we moved on to another team. We were still getting a paycheck. Like it wasn't survival mode. For startups, it's always survival mode. And I think that triggers a set of behaviors around efficiency, around creativity, that leads to some of these innovations that you can't just replicate in an environment that doesn't have those natural tensions. So that's why at the start, I believed when I was doing Creative Cloud that, yes, I'm running my team like it's a startup. And sure, I mimicked a lot of behaviors that I saw from startups, but it missed that fundamental ingredient that I think sort of triggers. It's almost like for the comic book fans, it's something that triggers the X gene and turns you into a mutant. We didn't have that particular catalyst in the large company environment. But if you're a startup and you're like looking towards your next round of funding and you have 3 months of runway, those types of conditions help foster the type of creativity and innovation that you see from a lot of startups. And you just can't replicate that inside a larger company.
Great point. I was going to ask you if you did this because I talk about it in the chapter. Me at Adobe, primarily, especially kind of post 2008, that downturn, talking to people that were coming out of startups and maybe their startup had dissolved. And I was trying to convince them, you could come to this big company. And I would tell them, we operate like a startup. Yeah, no, we're very much like a startup, but you have that benefit of security. If the project doesn't go well, you'll still have a job. And I was earnest. I wasn't lying. But I was also deceiving my own self, I think. Did you ever say that to anybody, trying to convince them?
I absolutely did. It was part of my argument of everybody I tried to hire onto the team. I definitely used that argument. Like, we operate just like a startup. In fact, I went one better and said, my goal is to not prepare you to be the best engineer at Adobe. It's to be the best engineer no matter where you go. So I don't necessarily teach you the ways of Adobe and how to be successful here. I teach you past that. And that sold a lot of people. And I apologize to all of those people for my mistaken intentions. But yes, I too was very earnest when I did it.
We both had time at startups both before and after. I left Microsoft, went to go do startups, both of which failed, and then ran back to big companies. But I lived that life of I'm covering rent for this month because we don't have enough money, or like at any moment this whole thing will explode. Or the first company I left Microsoft to go do a startup, they ended up paying me at the end in just equipment because we'd had to lay off the whole team because we ran out of cash. And couldn't pay me, but we were trying to find new ways to raise cash. So they just started giving me, would you like this equipment in lieu of paying you? And I'm like, sure. So I did that for a little while, but that fear is very catalyzing and is very focusing. That I remember, I probably told you this story before because it was so striking to me. I left Microsoft to work at this company called Bootleg Networks, which was in the early music space. And we raised some money. We were not profitable, but we were growing and there was a lot of excitement. This was 2000, so the dot-com bubble was starting to explode, but it wasn't as obvious yet. We moved into a new office and we went to go buy equipment, and we bought a bunch of equipment at a auction of other company stuff.
Yeah.
And we ended up buying a bunch of other startup stuff. And I remember we got a whiteboard and they hadn't bothered to erase it. And they listed a bunch of clients. We bring the whiteboard into our office and I look at it and there's a list of clients and there's a note next to them like, if we don't sign these 3 clients, we're dead. And they're like, all right, I guess they never signed them. There is that kind of urgency in a startup of like, we have to survive or we all are out of a job.
Yeah.
You don't have that in the big company. Is that there's the lack of resources as opposed to resource contention? That's very focusing. Like, what are we going to do with what we have? There is if we don't make it happen, we don't have a job. So there's that kind of risk. There's also the reward that you don't get. So to your point, as you're trying to hire startup people into whether it was Adobe or Fastly or wherever, and you're telling them, hey, we're like a startup, except you don't have to worry about, losing your job if the project doesn't work out.
Right.
But on the other hand, if the company does well, you still get paid. How much do you think? Obviously, the risk is a catalyzing thing. It helps spur focus and things. How much of it is the reward? Because I think the reward for startups has changed a lot over the last 15, 20 years.
Oh, definitely. Early on, especially in my pre-Adobe startup, the reward seems just like boundless, right? Like,
yeah,
if you succeed here, you'll be a multi-billionaire. You'll be able to retire at 26. At least that was the vibe a lot of folks had got. Post Adobe, it was still a little bit like that, but then as the years went on, people realized that the unicorns were fewer and far between. More people realized that, well, not everybody makes out like a bandit from that. So how much the reward motivated people depended on the person and the opportunity. So like I said, going to Hetio, the vision of the reward was a lot easier to see because of the people involved and the time period when this was all happening. Cloud was getting huge, Kubernetes was the thing, and you're working with the people who created it. Your chances of success were much greater than another cloud native company down the road that just had like 5 guys who said, hey, let's do a startup. So that actually played into a lot of my decision making post Adobe. It was, where am I getting the reward? Is it going to be completely monetary? Is it career growth? Is it going to be just the team that I'm working with? And I tried to optimize for that more so than just thinking, oh, I'm going to join the startup and in 2 years we're going to IPO or we're going to get acquired and I'll make $1 billion. I think I got a little bit more pragmatic about that over time. And I think a lot of folks in the industry have gotten a little bit more pragmatic about it. The days of there being a Google and a Facebook all hitting at around the same time, they're pretty much done. There are still going to be contenders like the OpenAIs of the world, but it's just not the same economic situation anymore. And I think people's attitudes about tech have also changed, that what people are seeking from these opportunities has changed. So what the reward is for them is vastly different than it was when we were coming up.
I think that's 150% correct. I think the reason people talked about joining startups, there really was these stories of these companies growing huge and people making tons and tons of money. But now people, I think, are a lot more realistic, which is that chances of that happening are near zero. Practically, they were always near zero. We just told ourselves a story that they weren't.
Yep.
I think now people realize that they're near zero. And what they're doing is they're choosing the culture, they're choosing the environment, they're choosing to be in a place that innovates that way. And it's more about the style of working. And the risk is still there. It's not that the risk went away. The reward is different. The reward is now you get to work in an environment that you enjoy or that suits your personality or suits the way you want to work. And you take the risk that it may not work out, but you're happier most of the time. And so that's kind of worth it. And yeah, you may do okay too. But I can definitely tell you, I've had, 2, 3 successful exits.
Mm-hmm.
And, at a C level. And I've made way more money working at big companies, not even very senior roles, getting stock options that vested over time. And just, made way more money in my career from having been at Microsoft or Adobe. And a lot of that is also luck and timing.
Yep.
More so than anything else, than I have with having been a CTO at a startup that sold for a lot of money.
I think you said the key word there that has changed, and it's luck.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think people discounted how much luck plays into it. So again, when people were young and idealistic and it's like, yes, I'm going to join the startup and it's going to make $1 billion. Yeah, if you're lucky. And most of the time, you're not lucky. I actually had the different experience. I actually did make a lot of money from my exits, more so than I had made career-wise, but that was purely luck. It was like, it wasn't that we created any groundbreaking product. It was we were in the right place, the right time, with the right set of conditions, and that worked out. And that was life-changing for me and my family, and I'm grateful for it. But I had way more security at the large company and steady money, and I never complained. I was quite content. But because I made certain choices at certain times in my life, I ended up in the right place at the right time to benefit from one of these exits. And there you have it. And there was no predetermining this. There was no playbook for it. It was purely luck.
I'll say I made more money having worked at those big companies just over time. And a lot of that had to do with luck. If I joined Microsoft 5 years later, it might have been very different. If I joined Adobe 5 years later, it would have been very different. So, acknowledging that 100%. But at the same time, the reason why I'm not at either of those companies anymore, even though I probably make less for not being there, is because I'm way happier. And I enjoy my work. I enjoy the environment. I enjoy the culture of the places. I loved working at Adobe, but I enjoy doing what I'm doing now just much better. It's just because it is a small company where we can move much more nimbly, where we have much more ability to experiment and to try things and to learn and do things that wouldn't have if I was back at Adobe or at Microsoft or even at a Google or Amazon today. So, all right, we're getting to the end here, but I do want to bring up, having written this chapter a year after I left Adobe, where I'm kind of looking back at my experience relative to having been at this startup for a year and saying, you know what, I don't think that model works so well. And I was really talking very specifically about my own experience, and trying to generalize it. I think this idea of a university model would work better. And part of that was because when I was at Adobe and work on Revel and having like 5 meetings trying to justify why we were using AWS instead of the corporate hosting infrastructure and using GitHub instead of Perforce, and just wasting tons of time. My dream was that we would go rent an office somewhere away from the Adobe office, kind of like the Xbox team did at Microsoft, and then like go work there and pretend like we didn't belong there. We weren't part of this bigger company. But thinking like that, like, oh, you know what, this is maybe a better model for innovation. There are companies that have done something kind of like this. Around this time, Eric Ries was also kind of taking his lean startup idea and trying to figure out how to do it in the enterprise. And he really has been advocating for this internal skunk works with kind of internal VC model. I was aware of that, I think, when I wrote this, and I was kind of saying, no, that's not going to work. You got to get them out of the house. Having been at startups, do you think that's actually a viable, that university model? Let's spin it off and we're investors, but we get the benefit, but if it fails, it fails kind of model. Do you think that would work?
It'll work for some definition of work, right? And if the goal is to create the set of conditions that might lead to innovation, it will definitely work better than the skunkworks approach, right? Because again, you're reintroducing the risk. You're creating a runway. Like, you only have so much funding. You only have so much time with that university model, which is different than the, hey, we're going to let you, quote unquote, behave like a startup inside with nothing else changing. Yes, I think that model would work, but it really just comes down to what are the incentives. If you're trying to drive innovation, yeah, I'd probably go that route if you can't change the culture of your company in a sufficient amount of time that you can just sort of get those behaviors naturally. Skunkworks are good in the short term. They're a good endorphin hit. The people working on it have a good time. But I've yet to see a situation where folks on a skunkworks project don't run into the standard corporate DNA that then pretty much snuffs out all the excitement, all the momentum of what they were doing. So I just fundamentally don't believe the skunkworks model works, except for very small things with very minimal impact. For the larger impact that the companies want to get by sort of creating this sort of startup environment inside a large company, I think the university model stands a better chance. But I think the thing that probably would work better is for them to constantly reassess, is our culture helping us or hurting us? Because that's what it comes down to at the end of the day, is have we gotten so ossified in our behaviors and our culture that we're ourselves stifling innovation? And should we revisit some of those things that we sort of hold as truths within this company and really reassess it and actively change it? I try to tell my teams whenever I build them, like, hey, nothing's written in stone. Like, we're going to try some stuff. If it doesn't work, we change it. And I think if you can take that sort of attitude to these larger companies and realize that, hey, why aren't we moving as fast as this startup? Or why is it that the last big product that we created in-house was 15 years ago? If there's a little bit more introspection and willingness to change the culture, that would actually move things a lot faster. And I think going back to Microsoft, since we started the conversation with them, that's what Satya did when he came in. He basically changed the culture. And that's what's needed. And it needs to come from somebody at that level to really drive that sort of change, to sort of trigger innovation again.
I love what you just said, because that is the problem. The problem isn't that these companies can't innovate, is that they're set up specifically to just make it hard to do that. You can try these different programs to enable and encourage innovation within the company, but if that's not who the company is, it doesn't matter. You can do all the programs you want, but the sort of dominant company culture is going to reassert itself. So it is really coming down to a question of company culture and how much you are willing to change the culture to get that level of innovation. And changing it means sometimes, like Satya did, getting rid of a whole bunch of people who were really built on this old culture and very much don't have any incentive to change at all.
Absolutely.
Because that's how they got to where they were.
Yeah, and they will protect it.
That's a great place to end. I want to thank you so much for being the first guest on the It Depends podcast. I have always appreciated talking to you. I am so happy I can have a chat with you and hopefully share your knowledge with more folks. How do people reach you if they're interested or want to talk to you more or learn more from you?
These days, you can find me on LinkedIn, K Stewart. I'm also K Stewart on Blue Sky, which is my new social media home these days. So people can reach you there if they have other questions or just, want to say hi. Your day job, you're at Splice. Can you tell me more about what's going on at Splice? Sure. So if you are a music creator, Splice is the largest provider of royalty-free samples. So if you're looking for some great loops and one-shots to add to your project, come check us out at splice.com. And we're also starting to build more tools for music creation. If you are looking for a new digital audio workstation to play with, I recommend checking out Studio One Pro 7, which now has a Splice integration that allows you to use our search with sound feature. That'll help you find complementary sounds to the ones you're working on in your project. And people are falling in love with that feature. So go check it out. And I believe you're hiring. We are indeed hiring across multiple functions, product management, design, and of course, engineering. So if you're looking to work on some great creative software, come check us out at splice.com. We'd love to talk to you. Thanks so much, Kevin. I really always love talking to you, but it's fun to have this conversation in this way. So thanks for coming on. It was an absolute pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm always happy to talk with you, my friend. You too, my friend. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I certainly did, although, of course, I was part of it. Kevin and I agree on a lot of stuff. We don't agree on everything, and that's actually very valuable to me
because he and I will push each other a little bit and challenge each other. And as I said earlier, like that's incredibly important. If you're going to talk to peers, you want some folks to challenge you. I call it my personal board of directors. I've heard other speakers or writers call it other things, but that's what I call it, my personal board of directors. And essentially, a board of directors in a company, like I've been on a board of directors, the idea is that they are holding the executive team responsible and challenging the executive team and making sure that the executive team are doing the right things for the business. My personal board of directors, which Kevin is absolutely on, challenge me. And I can go to them for help and say, I'm trying to figure this out. Or I was thinking about this. Do you agree with me? And if they're only going to be yes all the time, you're not going to get a lot of help from them. I like these folks who will challenge me. That's always something I'm looking out for. And Kevin is great at that because, as I said, he and I generally agree about many things. And you heard that. But we don't agree about everything. And I think you heard some of that too in this conversation. It was so fun to have. So hopefully in the future, we'll do more of that because I did see that in the survey. And if you haven't taken the survey, please take the survey. It's linked from the show notes and it's linked on itdependsbook.net. But now we're going to go into the chapter that he and we talked about a lot of stuff, but that was the core of the conversation. The chapter is called The Myth of the Startup in the Large Company. The Myth of the Startup in a Large Company, originally published on August 10th, 2014. I was reading a post from John Gruber, which had this paragraph in an ad for the iOS development team at Google. My thanks to Google. That's right, Google. Kind of awesome, right? For sponsoring this week's DF RSS feed. They're hiring developers and designers for their iOS app teams, which operate like a startup within the walls of Google. And I thought about the number of times I'd heard that line. Operates like a startup within insert large company name here. Or operates like a startup, but without the risk. I've heard that line many times from recruiters or friends. To be honest, I've even said it myself a few times, trying to sell a prospective candidate who I was trying to woo away from a startup. That notion of working like you're in a startup, but being part of a much larger organization is a myth. Anyone who says it is naive, disingenuous, or just plain wrong. Large companies that try to build these kinds of teams, be it innovation lab, startup experiment, or corporate startup incubator, usually fail to achieve the innovation or energy they seek. The result is typically wasted money and angry employees who feel like they were promised a bill of goods. Stuart Butterfield, discussing the experience of selling Flickr to Yahoo, said, "They sold out to Yahoo assuming that they'd be backstroking in rivers of money and terabytes of memory. Instead, they had to fight for everything: servers, people, time." Butterfield is talking about the inverse problem, but it comes down to the central crux of the issue at large companies: resource contention. It is a problem beyond the innovator's dilemma. In a startup, you spend all of your attention finding the right product market fit, finding customers, finding a flow of income, and/or finding investment. You will make the trade-offs you need to get your product off the ground. Often, this may mean choosing poor technologies in the short term to help you get going more quickly. Your resources are limited. You need to make do to get going. Maybe you will take some shortcuts in other areas just to get the product launched. You are fighting for your life and income and will do whatever it takes to get there. Why do you do it? Because you love the energy or are looking for the fiscal payoff. No risk, no reward. In a big company, you don't have to make those trade-offs. There's probably a very mature infrastructure to build on, a brand to build off, and the promise of a paycheck, no matter what the outcome. It is these conditions that destroy the innovation. There is a mature infrastructure, but it may not fit what you are trying to build. Maybe you just need some minor tweaks, but the infrastructure team primarily focuses on serving the existing groups that bring in the revenue. It will be hard for them to prioritize your needs. Maybe you can even prototype or launch with your own skunkworks infrastructure. That won't last for long. The corporate infrastructure is vetted, financed, and regulatory compliant. They own their turf and don't appreciate someone jury-rigging something else. There is a brand, but that brand is well known and highly controlled. You can't launch just anything using that brand. It needs to be vetted. Instead of building your product, this means you focus on getting internal support. Maybe you launch under some new secret brand. This may work for a while, but if you are successful, there will be increasing pressure to join the fold. And in any case, launching under a secret brand kills the benefit of being part of the parent company. The lack of risk is its own deterrent. Knowing that you get the paycheck is nice, but it is also understanding that you have little ownership of the outcome. It isn't your product. It is your corporation's product. You are just one of the people on the team. While you may still put in startup hours for the joy of it, eventually you will realize that you aren't getting the startup reward for all your hard work, which is demoralizing. The general problem is even if you have the deep pockets of a large corporation backing you, you don't have the ability to do what it takes to survive. From the minute the project is launched, you are on a clock. You will be restricted from specific business models because you are part of a larger, presumably already profitable parent. It is hard to justify spending a few years taking substantial losses to scale your business quickly when you are seen as a drain on the profits of your parent company. With its "don't ask us about profits" model, Amazon could never have been created as a division of Microsoft. The shareholders would have rebelled. If you don't succeed quickly, the teams around you will covet your team's resources. They're like vultures waiting for you to fail, and they will rush to declare you a failure as early as possible if they think they can benefit from it. If you are successful and start to grow, you will have the same problem. Teams will attempt to co-opt your mission, take over your team, switch you onto the official technology stack, or flood you with resources trying to get some of your startup energy. If you are successful by startup standards, that may not be seen as much of a success in a larger parent company with an established business. Being slightly profitable is a huge win for a startup. Being barely profitable is a significant loss for an established corporation. So, how do you create a startup in a large company? I think the university model is an interesting approach. Say you are company X, a large multinational technology company, and you are constantly challenged by your inability to move at startup speed or innovate. Instead of creating a startup team inside some division, create an actual startup. Solicit pitches from your entrepreneurial employees. Pick one or more and fund them as independent companies. Give the founders an equity stake in the new venture, but your company will also own a significant stake, plus some non-exclusive licenses on the IP. Allow them to recruit from your company, but they will no longer be employees of your company. If the venture fails, they may be able to interview to rejoin their former company, and they may get some of their benefits back, but there is no guarantee of employment. Also, get them out of your building. Allow them to raise outside investment if they need it. By sponsoring your employees, they are likely to build in a compatible way with your company's work, given that it is their training. They will know your industry. They won't be complacent because they can't afford to be. They will also be invested because they will directly benefit from their success. Ultimately, you will get the innovation you want, probably cheaper than if you tried to fund it within your own cost structure with all of its overhead. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Really appreciate it. Would love to hear your comments about this, especially because it's a big change from what I've done in prior episodes. You can send me comments. Again, I'm going to call out the survey. Please fill out the survey. It's linked in the show notes. It's linked from itdependsbook.net. You can also send me email, contact@itdependsbook.net if you have comments or questions. Also, the next episode is the final chapter of the book. But as I think I've already made clear in this episode and prior, we're going to keep going. Some of the episodes we're going to do immediately following the completion of the audiobook is answer your questions. So I've already gotten a bunch of questions. I've actually been saving them up for a little while, and I'm going to answer them in one or maybe more dedicated episodes to your questions and my answers. I would always love more questions. Please send those to contact@itdependsbook.net. And I would love to answer your questions. And when you do, please let me know if it's okay to use your first name, use your last name, where you are, what company you work for, whatever you're happy with me sharing. Thanks to everybody who bought the book during the sale last month to celebrate the anniversary of the publication. It really meant a lot to me to see how many of you took advantage of those sale prices. The sale price on bookshop.org and all the non-Amazon bookstores, for reasons I explained in the prior episodes, it's harder to change the prices on Amazon. So those prices are still there for a little bit longer. I don't think we're going to go back to the original prices now that the book's been out for a year, but it'll probably go up. So if you didn't get a chance to buy the book in the big sale last month, it might still be a good time to buy the book from bookshop.org or Barnes & Noble or any of the other bookstores, because it'll still be on a lower price for a little while. Thanks again. I will see you next week in the newsletter. I will see you back here on the podcast for the final chapter of the book. Have a great week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.